communities working together can have a major impact on the prevention of child abuse.
On this week's Health Talk, we'll discuss the Greater Norwalk area's proactive approach to stopping child abuse with strong advocates for this cause.
So stay tuned for this very important show.
Eric and I are up next.
Hello, I'm Dr. Eric Mazur.
And I'm Dr. Vicki Smitak. Today we're going to talk about the prevention of child abuse, a very important topic facing all of us. Joining us are Carrie Pesavento, who's the director of the Children's Connection, and Richard Colangelo, state's attorney for the Stamford-Norwalk District. Welcome to both of you.
Welcome to Health Talk.
Thank you.
This is a really important topic. I think that in the last decade or so, people are finally talking about. But tell us maybe how you got interested in it. You're an attorney and you're in social work, is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, how did you each get interested in this topic?
Well, I started my career at the Sexual Assault Crisis Center and was working with adults and children who had been sexually assaulted. And I felt a bit limited in, I certainly could support them, but there wasn't much I could do with the back end of holding the offenders accountable, of really doing anything to make sure that that end got taken care of. And so by joining Children's Connection and the Human Services Council, I'm able to do both things now. I can support the family and we get to hold the offenders accountable.
And it's a partnership, right, Rich? I mean, like Carrie said, it's about the law enforcement side, really a good marriage between that and providing services and support to the victim who's
Absolutely.
involved.
I mean, and it's so important because the team's an investigative team, so it ultimately helps the prosecution of these individuals and make sure that they're held accountable. But we have to also make sure that the victim is getting the support that they need and their family is getting the support that they need. So it would absolutely support partnership.
Sure, and all that is very important. But let's take a few steps back and talk more, I guess, in general terms about abuse in our communities. I mean, there's physical abuse, there's sexual abuse. I'm sure that all types of cases come through your radar. But talking a little bit about the prevalence of abuse in general in our communities, I know it's underreported. We learn as physicians in our training that, to look for certain signs and symptoms when children present to the emergency room and maybe the story doesn't quite make sense. So we're trained to try to pick up on that, but these cases don't always show up in the emergency room. They're not always that severe or obvious. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that.
They run the whole gamut of, like you said, from severe physical to sexual, and that's what we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing them happen in, every community, every age group, every demographic, every socioeconomic scale. So it really has no boundaries.
So affluent communities are not immune to this,
Absolutely
as we
not.
might think.
Yeah,
these parents are
I think,
educated. Why would they do this?
A problem of the dispossessed or the socioeconomically challenged. This problem runs all the way through to the.
Absolutely, and social media, or the way the kids are living nowadays, online and living, electronically, it only affects them even more. So we're seeing that in the greater
I was going to say, do you think it's
socioeconomic.
more common today than 25 years ago? When I was growing up, I don't think we heard about this. Looking back, I can think of people who might have been predators around me as a kid, but I certainly wasn't aware of this as a problem.
And maybe there was a different threshold also. I mean, not that it's ever acceptable, but now, we're recognizing it and we're holding people accountable for their actions that are not correct actions.
And I think it's actually easier for people to talk about it and come forward and report it. So I don't know if there's any more back then or any more now than there was back then, but I think people are more comfortable reporting it. And with organizations like the Children's Connection, there's things in place to support the victims and actually help the police and DCF do their investigations.
Now, Rich, I know you do a lot of work in the school systems locally with internet safety, and you mentioned that the access to social media and internet in general has really changed the playing field. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
It has. I mean, it's given people access to our children in a way that, as parents, we might not be monitoring as best as we should.
Right.
So it's giving them the ability to go, have that one-on-one contact with our kids or seeing what our kids are doing. So, most of these cases that we see, people are known to the victim. So that gives them the ability to become friends with the victim, if you will.
Right.
And the victim becomes more comfortable with this person, and they might talk them into or have them do something they might not do without that connection.
So Rich, you think we're seeing, we really talk about family members being the abusers, but then, quote, strangers, and now strangers, as you say, have easy access to our kids through social media. Do you think there's an increasing number of these quote, strangers interacting with children?
Absolutely. It's really one of the things that the social media and all of the different applications and apps on different phones and have allowed is for children to become comfortable with strangers, folks
Right.
that they've never met, that they're now setting up meetings, and it's opened an avenue for much more danger.
I mean, think about they're called friends, right? I mean,
Right.
everybody has a Facebook account, and
Absolutely.
you have your Facebook friends. So once you're friends with someone, you have a sense that you have some idea of who they are as a person,
Right.
even though
And-
you've never met them before.
Right.
And as I guess as a molester, you can pose anything you want to do.
Absolutely. They pretend that they're a 12-year-old boy or a 12-year-old girl, and they become friends with them and ask them all kinds of personal information. And it's not uncommon for these online relationships to last, 3 or 4 months or even longer, making the victim feel much more comfortable. Slowly over time, they're giving information about themselves
Right.
that they wouldn't normally tell a stranger on the street, but they're not a stranger because I
Yeah.
know them online. And
Right.
it really is creating much more dangerous situations.
And that's
for
why in
the
the
kids.
majority of these cases, the victim knows the perpetrator.
Yeah.
I mean, they were finding that there really isn't the stranger case, as you were talking about, Eric, is very rare now.
Are those easier or harder to prosecute? I'm just thinking, I mean, you have so much more material, right? You have conversations and whatnot.
We have a lot more material, but I also have a compliant victim, because I have somebody that is,
Yeah.
they're in love with this person. They don't want to see anything bad happen to this person. So
Right.
it's harder on that aspect of the prosecution.
That's interesting, and that's important information for parents out there watching. To the point you made earlier, it's important to be involved in what our kids are doing and who their friends are, to question any new friendships that they're making on social media and stuff like that. Although, again, most of us who have young kids on this set can attest to the fact that it's easier said than done.
Absolutely.
I was
Because
just
they're
gonna
in their
ask that
room
question.
with their phone, and you don't always have access to what they're
Absolutely.
doing.
Yeah, how does one? I can see with little kids will, by little I have 9 and 8-year-old granddaughters, and they'll pretty much do what you ask them.
Right.
But once they're 12, 13, they have their own phone. They can go into the bedroom. I remember my kids when they were that age. They didn't want any part of us in their
Right.
social world.
Sure.
So how do you get into that world to keep your kids safe, but not be so intrusive that you drive your kids crazy?
It's communication, knowing what they're doing, talking to them about it, and think about the golden rule: he who has the gold makes the rules. So as parents, we're buying the devices, and we're providing the internet connection, we're providing the services. So we have to be parents. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many cases I've come across where I've asked a parent to look at their kid's device, and they tell me that, well, it'd be invasion of their privacy.
That's a great. I'm glad you're saying
And
this.
it's that's a parent trying to be their kid's friend,
Right.
not actually parent their child.
Right.
And that's a problem for us in the system, because we have to deal with it.
I think that's such an important point, Rich, and as a pediatrician, I see this all the time with interactions between parents and their adolescent or tweens about this feeling that we don't want to be intrusive. But again, at the end of the day, we're the parents, we're buying these
Absolutely.
devices, they're living in our homes, and quite frankly, we know better. you
Right.
know?
And Vicki,
I mean, that's really the
they're still
reality
kids.
of it.
They
They're still
want the
kids.
boundaries. They want us to provide them some structure.
Right.
And if we're not and they're running amok, I mean, that's when
Yeah.
we see the kids doing the risky behaviors that put them at
Absolutely.
risk to maybe come in contact with somebody that might take advantage of them or try to take advantage of them.
And a lot of the teens that I see in our office do say, I was going to go meet this person, but my father came out, and so I was actually happy that I couldn't go. And
Interesting.
because they had this feeling inside them that this probably wasn't
a good
safe,
idea. Yeah.
but they had gotten themselves in the situation and didn't know how to get out. And so
Yeah.
sometimes they may not say it, they may not say thank you, but
Right.
in a lot of those cases, they really are looking for someone to get them out of it.
But it's interesting that they'll disclose that to you.
Yes. Well,
and-
it's after the fact,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, but they also tend to say things more to people that aren't family members.
Right, absolutely.
Right. So I know my daughter would probably very rarely say to me, yes, Mom, you were right, but she'd be more likely to say it to you privately in a conversation.
But
so.
the internet itself, and I am not technological, but the internet itself breaks all sorts of boundaries. Things that were really taboo, were really hard to access, pornography and other things, are really so
Common
available now. Is it changing the boundaries of what kids think is appropriate? And it's sort of making these taboo things almost expect. I've heard things about kids without getting into detail that really, and I'm no prude, shocked me compared to where I was growing up.
It
And I
is. We're
grew up in
seeing
the
it.
'60s.
We're seeing it more and more. I mean, in this generation's idea of what's private is a lot different than our generation.
Right.
And the sad thing for them is that it's our generation that's making the decision about whether they get into the school that they want to get into, or they get into they get the job that they want. So a lot of the stuff that they're doing, because it's out there permanent, it's actually affecting them as they get older. And so we're seeing it more and more. I mean, the shocking aspect, with kids just trading the inappropriate pictures is, I'm getting calls at least once a week from the area police departments on, hey, we have this situation in this school or in this community, what should we do?
And what do they do? I mean, if it's consensual and it's among students that are underage,
It's
right?
not,
So
yeah, it's not
like you have-
consensual adults, it's consenting,
It's consenting
children, so
children,
can they
right.
really consent?
And the problem is, for the kids involved, if they're under 16, it potentially could be child pornography, depending on what the pictures are showing or how they're depicting themselves.
Right.
So, if you're possessing child pornography in Connecticut, it's a mandatory jail sentence. If they're doing it consensually, Connecticut has a sexting statute, if you will, where it's only a misdemeanor, so it's not mandatory jail time. They don't have to register as a sex offender. But what I'm finding, and the police are finding, is that these pictures don't only go to hey, boyfriend, girlfriend, and now they break up, so those pictures get
Right, they
all over
think
the place.
they're private, but I mean, I've read this innumerable times that
Right.
the kids think that they have this unique private relationship, and of course it blows up, as most relationships do over time.
We've had cases
Sure.
where the kids are trading them like baseball cards to where people are selling them in different schools, different
So
images.
how do you educate kids? I mean, there must be a lot of education that you're trying to do, and do our schools have these curricula? Are you brought into the schools?
They do. I mean, I know Carrie does some programming. I'm doing programming with the area police departments.
What
going
age?
in.
What age are you trying to get the kids at?
Honestly, middle school.
Yeah.
I've done as young as 3rd grade, but the message should start about 5th or 6th grade, and then by the time they reach high school, the kids know everything. So then the message really turns
it's-
to, it's hey, you know what? This is why the risky behaviors that you're acting and doing, that's going to affect you when you get older.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to get the message out early, like you're doing. I mean, and 3rd grade, it can be too young developmentally and whatnot, but 4th, 5th, I mean,
Right.
again, most 3rd graders in my son's class have iPhones.
Right.
And
They do.
It's. I mean, they're playing video games on them, but still, it's staggering the
But
access
even the
that they
video
have.
games can be dangerous. In
Sure.
some, you get Xbox Live or some of the
And they can have
the games on their
interactions.
phone. They can interact
Yeah.
with other people that they don't know, and so having those conversations with your kids about if someone approaches you to chat during a game or that kind of thing, that you can shut them off, you can block them, let us know, is important even at that young age,
Sure.
because it's sort of just creating that situation.
And one thing we haven't talked about yet or enough, I think, is the family abuse, the inter-family. So, we have to go to a break now, but
Yeah, we can
perhaps
talk
we
about
can
it.
talk a little bit more about that when we come back.
Yeah, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more also about the Children's Connection and the services that you
Yeah.
provide there.
Great.
So thank you both, and we'll be back after a short break. Hi, Eric and I are back with Carrie Pesavento and Rich Colangelo, and we talked a lot in general terms, and we got into some specifics in the first segment about abuse in general, internet safety, access that predators may have to our children. I think that it's such a scary topic when you really think about the breadth of it, how expansive it is, and how potentially victimize these children can be just by having a phone given to them as a gift or a computer in their room. But once these cases come to your attention, Carrie, tell us a little bit more about the Children's Connection and what your role is in taking a child who's been abused or been victimized in some way through the process and helping them come out of it feeling supported.
Sure. So in the state of Connecticut, we have the mandated reporting law. So anyone that is responsible for the care of a child professionally is mandated to report anytime they suspect a child is being abused or neglected. So once that report is made, whether it's a teacher, a pediatrician, a coach, a church leader, anytime that report is made, they call the Department of Children and Families, and I think that hotline number was just posted. And you do not need to have proof that that's happening. A parent can call that number. Anyone can make that report.
You just have
So
to
this-
have a suspicion.
You just have
And
to
I
have
think that's
suspicion.
an important point to
Right.
make if you suspect. And are there any things clues that people at home should use to suspect that this is going on?
Honestly, as a prosecutor that actually prosecutes people that don't report, I mean, my thinking honestly is if you think about it, it's in your mind, it's on your radar, then you should report it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's that simple.
And if it's unfounded or
No
you're
harm, no
not
foul.
So
Right.
almost like said that are about terrorism. They say if you see something, say something.
something.
Right.
It's the
That's
same
it.
sort of
So
approach.
once that report is made to the Department of Children and Families, they notify local law enforcement, and they then notify me. And we are a nationally accredited children's advocacy center, and the purpose of that is to provide a safe, friendly, kid-friendly, comfortable environment for the children to be interviewed by a specially trained forensic interviewer. And in an adjoining room, we have law enforcement, DCF, anyone that would need
So you two
to
work
see-
together
Yeah.
physically,
We do.
and so you're in the next room as some of these interviews are taking place?
Usually the police, law enforcement, DCF, and Carrie are there. The prosecution is the end user of the investigation. We get involved as early as the police want us to. We meet as a team twice a month to talk about the cases. So I'm brought in, or one of my staff is brought in pretty quickly on the cases.
So when a child is brought into the Children's Connection, take us kind of through the process. What happens? So they come in usually with their parent.
So they come in with their parent. I explain the process to the parent. As you can imagine, many of the caregivers are very
Traumatized.
upset. They're scared. They don't
Sure.
know what's going to happen. They don't know if they want to get law enforcement involved. What's going to happen next? And so we
Right.
explain that process. We get all of their questions answered. All of that while the children are just playing and having fun. So I always tell the parents, the child won't remember coming here. The parent will never forget. But we want to make sure that they're very supported throughout the process. When the child goes in for their interview, it's just the child and an interviewer in the room. The rest of us, the investigative team, can watch it on closed circuit TV. We can ask questions through a microphone into the interviewer's ear. And the non-offending parent is down the hall getting support from one of our advocates and crisis counselors, getting more information about the process. They may be able to give us more information that would help us to further the investigation. And then we all come back together as a team with the parents to explain what we learned, what we found out, what our next steps are, where the investigation will go from there. We can also set up medical services if the child needs a medical
Right,
exam.
I was gonna ask you about
Yeah,
that next.
mental health counseling for both the parents and the child, or any siblings that may be affected as well.
Let me ask you, just
Yeah.
from another perspective, how do you prevent this process from being abused? You've got a custody battle between a mother and a father, and the mother decides, well, I'm going to say the father abused the child, and that'll give me,
It's one of the
which
things
seemed to
that-
be fairly
Yeah.
easy to do from the standpoint of.
It gets raised a lot, but statistically, you don't see it happening in those cases as many times as people raise it. But one of the things that we do, our protocol talks about is when are we going to do a forensic interview? And there has to be a disclosure. We're not going to it's not a fishing expedition. It's not, hey, I think something happened.
Okay.
The child actually has to disclose some abuse, and then we'll be able to do a forensic interview on it. I mean, I'm in that situation, as the
Yeah.
prosecutor, I can't have people going out just, well, hey, I talked to this kid about this, because,
Okay.
it could be traumatic to the child to talk about
Yeah.
what we're asking them to talk about.
Sure. So it can't be the parent coming and saying, I
Absolutely
think
not.
my child is being abused by my
Could I-
husband or something.
That's just one
like
other
that.
question that comes up from the lay media more than anything else. But
Yeah.
you hear instances of these manufactured memories. You've got a child who is troubled, and they see a therapist who then helps the child manufacture memories. Have you encountered that, or is that also sort of a rare phenomenon?
Well, and that's one of the reasons that we've been doing a lot of training out in the community and to our schools and faculty members to really talk about minimal facts. When you're interviewing a child, when a child makes a disclosure, or when a child comes to you and tells you this, or you have that hunch, we really want to get the very least amount of information possible. We don't want them to ask a lot of questions on the child so that we can't lead them down that road. Once we get in and do the investigation, our interviewers are very well trained to not lead a child.
Okay.
But we do have those situations where you get the person, delayed disclosure coming in, this came out in therapy or hypnosis or whatever it may be, and those are the cases that are a lot harder to prove.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
we
I
might
can
not be
imagine
proceeding
that.
with those cases. If there's no independent evidence, I really can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, so we're not going to proceed on that situation.
Yeah, but getting back to what you were saying before about minimal facts and not subjecting the child to multiple interviews, I want to talk a little bit more about that because it could be very traumatic. It is obviously
Yeah, we
always
actually have
traumatic.
a graphic too,
Yeah,
we can
and we
bring
can
on this
bring
a little
that
bit
up.
about
We do.
your approach, or I should say our approach locally here, compared to sort of the old approach. And as soon as it comes up, we'll talk about it.
Great.
There we go.
Okay, tell us,
So-
what are we looking at here?
So the top half of this picture kind of shows what used to happen, and hopefully what doesn't happen anymore, where a child would come in, would disclose to, say, a school principal, and the school principal hears what happens, and they say, oh, we better get the social worker involved. And so the social worker comes in and they say,
They
tell
tell
me
their story
everything
again.
about it.
Yep.
And then they said, well, we should call the school nurse, and the school nurse hears everything about it. Well, meanwhile, the child's had to relive that story multiple times.
Yeah.
And they're also, there's the possibility that the story changes just ever so slightly. Kids are people pleasers. They get asked the same question multiple times, they may think that they're not answering it right.
Yeah,
and so,
so they
they
need to
may
say
change
something
it just
different.
a little bit different.
Yeah.
The bottom half is the Children's Advocacy Center model, where the child comes to this child-friendly space, and everybody that needs to hear that, the investigative parties, DCF, the police, we come there together. We don't make the child talk to
So this
each
is what
one
you
of
mean
us
by minimal
individually.
information. You want minimal information to
So
get them
that
into
they
the
can
bottom
get
half
there.
of that graphic.
That's right.
Yeah.
So to get them to that bottom half, to get them to the Children's Advocacy Center, we want them talked to by as few people as possible.
And the minimal information is pretty simple. It's, is the child safe right now? Who's the perpetrator? And,
they need
when did it
medical
happen?
care?
Yeah, when did they need medical care? How long ago did it happen? If it's a recent allegation, then we might be able to get some forensic evidence, DNA, stuff like that.
Right.
If it's, outside of that 72-hour window, then we're probably not going to subject the child to, a sexual assault kit or something like that.
Right, and then of course there's the question that we always ask as medical providers, and I'm sure you ask as well, are there any other children in the house?
Right.
And what's their exposure to this individual, especially if it's a family member or somebody who lives within the household. And we see a lot, we certainly see a lot of that where, it might be an uncle or it might be, a caregiver of some
Or a
sort.
rooming house situation
Or a
where
rooming
you
house.
have a family living in this section of the house, but then 3 other people are living in 2
Right.
rooms down the hall.
Right.
And that happens in that situation.
You
Yeah.
said before the show we were talking about something also very interesting. We're a very diverse country. We've got a diverse communities, different ethics and morals within those communities. They actually can impact what people consider abuse versus what is normal. And that must be even more problematic for you.
It is. I mean, culturally, we'll see people coming over from different countries saying, hey, it's okay for, I got married when I was 14 in my old country, and, I was having babies at 14. They'll come here and they'll see their children doing that and say, well, that's what happens. Well, that's not our laws here. So, there's an educational aspect to it, a reluctance on their part maybe to get the police involved.
Right.
But, when the child goes to the hospital because they're 14 and pregnant, then, the hospital is making the
It does
disclosure.
not seem like an easy area to work in, both emotionally, but just the complexity of this is really,
Right,
it's not
because
just
it
sort of
seems
this,
like there are
this
gray
ogre,
areas.
exactly, it's just not
Right.
ogres
This
out
could be
there.
a well-meaning 22-year-old who fell in love with a 15-year-old because this is what might happen customarily in El Salvador. I'm just
Right.
picking a country out of a hat.
Well, thank you
you know.
so much for being here. I wish
This
we
has
had
been
more
very
time.
enlightening.
Have to have you come back and talk some more because it's such an important
Yeah, there's so
topic.
much to cover.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So when Vicki and I come back, we'll have today's health question.
But right now, let's take a look at some of our future events sponsored by Western Connecticut Health Network. this week's viewer question is, why is the emergency department referred to as a safe haven?
And Vicki, this is really your area of expertise. We're talking about safe haven for infants and young children.
Right.
What do we mean by a safe haven? What circumstances would someone out in the community use the ED as a safe haven?
So the ED is used for a lot of different things, as those of us who practice medicine know. But really, this term safe haven, as I remember it and understand it, is a result of a statute that was passed over the past few years in this state, and I'm sure many others, where if a woman or a parent has an infant that they can't feel that they can care for whatever reason, instead of harming the infant or abandoning it somewhere where it might potentially die, that infant can be left at the emergency department of any hospital without any questions asked, without any accountability on that parent's part. It's basically saying, I'm leaving my baby in your care because I can't care for it myself.
We see this on TV, we hear about postpartum depression,
Yes.
women being at wit's end and
Yes.
wanting to harm their baby.
Yes.
I guess those thoughts are not that uncommon, even though acting on them is uncommon.
Yeah, and the thoughts are, you're exactly right. I think the thoughts are not uncommon. I think postpartum hormones and stress, maybe even having other children in the household and now having this infant who screams all the time, who's very demanding, can put stress on any sane person. So I
So
think
this is a way a
it's-
mother can basically protect the child
Yes.
from herself.
Exactly.
Or a father can. So this is a valuable thing for you at home to realize.
Absolutely.
Is that, God
if
forbid
you know
this happens to
someone
you.
like this, if you yourself, if you know someone who's struggling like this, please make them aware of the Safe Haven Act.
And if you at home have a question you'd like to ask us on Health Talk, please contact Vicki and me at healthtalk@norwalkhealth.org.
Eric and I would like to thank our guests, Carrie Pizzavento and Richard Colangelo, for coming on our show today, and we will see you next week on Health Talk.
Bye-bye.